Let's talk about wide receivers that you should start or sit in week 2 of the fantasy football season. We'll talk about all 32 teams, 16 matchups in total, and we are starting off with Thursday night football. We've got the Bills at the Dolphins, 48.5 point over under, and the Dolphins are actually favored at home. This is tied for the third highest over under of the week, so we should see more fireworks on Thursday night football in this one. The closest spread of the week as well, meaning Vegas thinks game script wise, both teams should be in this, which is very good for wide receivers. Let's start off with the Bills side of the ball, okay? Last week, the Dolphins gave up the 15th most points to fantasy wide receivers. They were kind of middle of the pack, all right? They had some cornerbacks who were dealing with injuries, though. For the Bills offense, it is absolutely great for real life football that they are spreading the ball around, but it absolutely sucks for fantasy football. Keon Coleman is the only name that you can consider starting, in my humble opinion. My wide receiver 39 on the week, so he is a spot start. He played the most snaps of any wide receiver with 73% of the snap share in week 1. He was targeted the most of any of the wide receivers with 5 targets. He's the only guy you can even think about throwing out there. And of course, he has touchdown upside with a name like Josh Allen throwing him the football. As far as Shakir goes, he is a sit for me. He only had 3 targets. Yes, one of them turned into a touchdown, but he played just over 50% of the snaps. It's just way too risky. And with Curtis Samuel, he ran just 9 routes. There's no way that guy can touch your lineup. Let's move on to the Miami side of the ball, starting off with Tyreek Hill, the fastest man on and off the field. 12 targets, 130 yards, over 26 PPR points in week 1. The dude is absolutely dominant. Of course, you start him. As far as Jalen Waddle goes, my wide receiver 12 on the week, another must start, has a really solid chance to continue his good start last week, which was 5 for 109 yards, over 16 PPR points. These guys both remain must starts on a weekly basis, regardless of the matchup. This should be a fun one to watch, though. Okay, let's start with the 1 p.m. Sunday Eastern Standard Time slate of games. Raiders at Ravens. 41.5 point over under. The Ravens are favored, and this is the largest spread of the week, which basically means that Vegas thinks the Ravens are going to dominate this game. They think that the Ravens are going to absolutely wipe the floor with the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, if that's the case, we might be a little concerned about Zay Flowers, because if they're not in a negative game script, how many targets goes his way? I mean, I am still labeling him a must start, but I am lowering expectations. Guys, last week he had 10 targets, should have been 14 if those penalties weren't called, but it's just disappointing to see 11 PPR points from a 26% target share from 10 targets. The average depth of target for Zay Flowers is just so low. I mean, at halftime, I think the average depth of target was like 1 for Lamar Jackson, just 1 single yard. It's like 5 targets for Jameson Williams in Detroit are worth like 11 targets for Zay Flowers in Baltimore. So yes, you can start him, but I would lower expectations, and I wouldn't be afraid to sit him if I had a better option. And as far as Rashad Bateman and Nelson Aguilar, we are not even going to talk about those guys. We're not considering it in a low volume passing offense. For the Raiders side of the ball, Devontae Adams does remain a must start. At least you can make the case that like the game script should be negative, so they should have to target him, but it is not a good defense to target. Yes, last week the Ravens gave up the 6th most points. However, they faced the Kansas City Chiefs. They faced Patrick Mahomes, Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, Travis Kelce. That's not a good indication of how good this defense will be season long. I think this is a very good defense. And Devontae Adams had a 19% target share in week 1. More importantly, he was out-targeted by rookie Brock Bowers, and Brock Bowers' his first game, and Bowers was coming off an injury. That's concerning. Are we going to see a change of the guard already in Las Vegas? Regardless, you have to start Devontae Adams, my wide receiver 20 on the week, and you just have to hope that this team is down and they are peppering him with targets. Moving on to the third matchup of the week, 38.5 point over under here with the Chargers at Panthers. This is tied for the second lowest over under of the week. So this might not be the best game to chase for fantasy football. Let's start with the Chargers side of the ball. Last week, the Panthers were 23rd in points allowed to wide receivers. To be fair, the Saints didn't really need to throw the ball very much after they dominated that game. Ladd McConkey, I would label a spot start. He would be the wide receiver I would start of any name here. I would start him over Josh Palmer. Ladd McConkey, my guy in 2024, started off really hot in week 1, 7 targets, caught 5 of them, got into the end zone, 15 PPR points. We have to keep in mind DJ Chark did not play last week, and that gave Ladd an opportunity to play in more 2 wide receiver sets. However, Ladd was targeted on almost 32% of his routes run, and he had a 28% target share in his first ever game. I really don't know how he could have had a better debut. We can keep rolling with him if he's your best option. As far as Josh Palmer, yes, he got ejected last game, so it's hard to know exactly what he would have done, but you can only consider him in deep formats, especially with Ladd McConkey already coming out of the gates hot. I just don't see how you can start Josh Palmer in most formats. Now, for the Panther side of the ball, there is no clear start at this point. Deontay Johnson, you can start him. Like, it couldn't have been more disappointing for the Panthers in week 1. Here's the hope for Deontay Johnson. Like, in one of my leagues, it's a deeper league, and he is my best option. Here's the hope you can hold on to. Deontay Johnson sat out most of the fourth quarter, and he had a 35% target share before that. So this team should be better than they were last week. I mean, you can't be much worse. And Deontay should be fed targets. So in PPR formats, I think he's a fine play, but there's not really much to chase here. The fourth matchup we're going to look at is the Saints at the Cowboys. 45.5 point over under. Cowboys are favored. Let's talk about the Saints side of the ball. Chris Olave, my wide receiver 17. Yes, I am going to label him a must start. No, we are not going to fade him because of last week. There was literally no reason for the Saints to target Chris Olave in week 1. There was not a single moment in that game where they needed to throw the ball, where they needed to find their alpha. They were just having fun pretty much from like 10 minutes into the first quarter onwards. They were dominating that game. But if you look at snaps, he had more snaps than any Saint not named Derek Carr. He had the most routes run of any player point blank period. And I understand he was disappointing in week 1, but we have 2 years of evidence that this is an alpha target share dominating type of player. In 2022, averaged 7.9 targets per game. Last year, 8.6 targets per game. So are you going to trust a 2-year sample size or 1 week? It's up to you, but I'm playing Chris Olave. Rashid Shaheed, however, is not someone I'm willing to start. To me, this is Gabe Davis with Josh Allen, but instead you have Derek Carr, so it's even less reliable. In 2023, we had 5 games for Rashid Shaheed over 15 PPR points. We had 10 games for him under 8 points. He's a much better best ball asset than a traditional redraft league, in my humble opinion. Moving on to the Cowboys side of the ball, CeeDee Lamb, you know you're starting him. Look, he had 10 targets last week. It was disappointing versus a very good Cleveland Browns secondary. However, he should bounce back in a huge way. And Brandon Cooks, I would label a spot start. He had 7 targets. He got into the end zone. He's a fine, desperation play in deeper formats. However, you are reliant on a touchdown for him to return a good day, and that is very difficult to project week in and week out. The fifth matchup we're going to look at here is the Bucs at the Lions. This is the highest over-under of the week. We should see a ton of fantasy cheese from this matchup. Lions, high-flying offense. Bucs coming off a huge win versus the Commanders. We are starting our Lions, obviously starting with the Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver 4 for me this week. Every superstar has an off game. We know this. Don't overthink it. He averaged over 20 points per game last year, and they gave him a huge bag, an extended contract. With Jameson Williams, he is one of my favorite spot starts of the week. If he repeats what he did in week 1, he will be a must start moving forward. That was so fun to watch. He's finally a full-time player. He played 85% of snaps, had almost a 30% target share. Full-time Jameson Williams is electric. Now, we can't expect that every week. That's why I do still have him as a spot start rather than a must start, but he's a fine option. I'd much rather play him than Brandon Cooks, for example, which we talked about earlier. Now, you can see here, it says that the Bucs are 32nd in points allowed, but there's context behind that. The context being they played rookie Jaden Daniels last week, and Jaden Daniels had no time to throw, and they didn't really target wide receivers down the field. That's going to be different, obviously, now that you're facing the Lions. We know the Bucs secondary was suspect all 2023. I still think this is a good matchup for them. As far as the Bucs themselves, I got 2 players I am labeling must starts. Mike Evans, still that dude. We know that. Chris Godwin, my start of the week last week. He got 22 PPR points. And now he has another great matchup versus the Lions, who in week 1 gave up the second most points. Obviously, Cooper Kupp, did his thing. But I think Godwin's going to be great out of the slot versus this team. I imagine the Bucs are going to have to throw it. I'm a huge fan of Chris Godwin in this matchup. The 6th matchup we're going to look at today is the Colts at the Packers. 2 teams that were top 12 in points allowed to wide receivers in week 1. Both of these secondaries got toasted to a crisp. Let's start with the Colts side of the ball. You can start Michael Pittman. He's my wide receiver 26. What a roller coaster of emotions it is watching Anthony Richardson play football. It's a combination of Cam Newton and Carson Wentz right after you finished a line of you know what, okay? It's like, that's what it's like watching this guy. He completed 9 passing attempts, and he was a top 5 quarterback in fantasy football. I love fantasy football. Look, you can start Pittman. He led the wide receiver room in snaps, routes run, and targets. Unfortunately, those targets weren't very good, which is what we were worried about with Michael Pittman on this channel, but you can still start him because he is the alpha. Look, I love Adonai Mitchell. He should have had 2 touchdowns last week if they were accurate targets, but you just can't start him right now in a low volume passing scenario. And I'm assuming Josh Downs isn't playing, but if Josh Downs is playing, there's no way you can start Pierce, Mitchell, or Downs. It's way too confusing. For the Packers side of the ball, this is technically a good matchup. However, Jordan Love is most likely not playing, at least at the time of recording this video. If you guys are watching this later and Jordan Love is playing, fantastic. Let's make Jayden Reed a top 25 name this week. Let's talk about Christian Watson as a spot start. But if it's not Jordan Love, it will be Malik Willis. And there is no evidence whatsoever that Malik Willis can support a fantasy wide receiver. In fact, this is probably the worst case scenario of any backup quarterback in the NFL. If you're expecting a touchdown from Jayden Reed this week, that would mean Malik Willis would have to do something that he's never done in the NFL ever, which is throw a passing touchdown. In his career, he has 3 interceptions, 0 passing touchdowns. I don't see how you start Jayden Reed, but maybe he's truly just your best option. I have my rankings here. You can decide that as you watch the video. And I am not even considering Watson or Dobbs or Wicks. There's just no way we can play those names. All right, the 7th matchup we're going to look at is the Browns at the Jaguars. 41.5 point over under, and the Jaguars are favored at home. Let's start with the Browns side of the ball. The Jags were 7th in points allowed last week to wide receivers. They gave up a ton of points to Tyreek and Jalen Waddle in that game. I am going to label Amari Cooper a must start. My wide receiver 30, he is truly on the edge, like the last guy in that must start versus spot start type of category. And honestly, Deshaun Watson is he's just not good at football anymore. I think the football gods cast a spell on him when they realized what he was doing behind closed doors. And I mean, it's like the Monstars took his power. I don't know what happened, but Amari Cooper still plays 72 out of 76 possible snaps. He led the team in routes run. He led the team in targets. And this is a much better matchup to chase rather than the Dallas Cowboys. We're not going to play Jerry Jeudy and chase a touchdown. We're not going to play Elijah Moore. As far as the Jags side of the ball goes, the Browns gave up the 8th most points to fantasy wide receivers in week 1. So it's a decent matchup. Brian Thomas Jr. is a spot start. You know, we talked all last week on our live streams and in our videos. Do you like to party? My name's Rod. I like to party. Brian Thomas is a party pick. He had an incredible debut in week 1, 80% of the snaps, led the team in targets, at least tied with 4, and scores a touchdown. Now, this is a very difficult matchup versus the Browns. I know they gave up the 8th most points to fantasy wide receivers in week 1, but their defense is legit. They get pressure really well from their edge rushers and their defensive line, and they have some pretty good cover corners over there. However, Brian Thomas just needs one big play to pay off. So again, I'll ask you, do you like to party? Because if you do, you can consider Brian Thomas Jr. If you want to play it safe, probably not the right name. Christian Kirk is another spot start, but his upside is so limited. He's not going to have those deep plays like a Brian Thomas Jr. will, and he might have limited touchdown upside. Okay, moving on to the 49ers at the Vikings. 45.5 point over under in this one, and the Niners are favored. I got 3 top 15 wide receivers in my rankings in this matchup alone. Deebo Samuel, of course you're starting Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk, you are starting him. I know he had a bad week last week. I mean, low key, we kind of predicted it. He was on our video that we said these players will bust, and Ayuk kind of busted. There was every reason to be out on him last week, but this week we are so far in, it's scary. He gets to face the Minnesota Vikings, who somehow were 16th in points allowed, even though they played the Giants last week. How in the world were they not number 1 and as far as fewest points allowed to wide receivers? So Deebo and Ayuk should go off. Ayuk should have a huge bounce back. And as far as Justin Jefferson, 6 targets, not what you want to see, but similar to Chris Olave, let me ask you, at what point in this game did the Vikings really need to throw the ball to Justin Jefferson? There wasn't a single point in this game they needed to do that. As far as Jordan Addison goes, I am labeling him a must sit. We don't even know if he's going to play. He probably won't. He certainly will be dealing with an injury if he does. Okay, the ninth matchup we're going to look at here is the Seahawks at the Patriots. 38.5 point over under. The Seahawks are favored. This is tied for the second lowest over under of the week. You might want to be careful chasing fantasy points from this one. Let's start with the Seahawks side of the ball. Now, the Patriots were 27th in points allowed to fantasy wide receivers last week. That was very good. Let's be honest, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and the wide receivers he had available to him could not get anything going. However, I'm still going to label DK Metcalf a must start. He was a huge flop in week 1, but that's the Pat Surtain treatment. There's a reason Pat Surtain is the number 1 paid quarterback in the NFL. Don't overthink DK. You got to put him out in your lineups. And then as far as Jackson Smith-Njigba goes, I am going to label him a must sit, but I would say there is good news for him. That is, he played above Tyler Lockett in snaps and saw work in 2 wide receiver sets. But the bad news is he had literally no opportunity to work with. But you could say the same thing about DK Metcalf. So JSN remains a high upside bench player. We just need to see some sign of hope. I hope that's this week versus the Patriots. And as far as the Patriots goes, there's literally no reason to talk about these wide receivers until Drake May takes over. They're all a strong must sit. Okay, the 10th matchup we're going to look at here is the Jets at the Titans. All right, the Jets headed to Tennessee. All right, 42.5 point over under. We got New York favored in this one, according to Vegas. As far as the Jets go, last week they gave up the 12th most points to fantasy wide receivers. I don't personally think that's a good indication of what this defense is capable of. They faced Brock Purdy, Shanahan, the 49ers, Trent Williams, Deebo Samuel, Ayuk, and Kittle. Okay, pretty much any defense in the NFL is going to find that difficult. I still think this is the worst matchup in fantasy football for your wide receivers, and that is why I am labeling Calvin Ridley a must sit. It's the same reasons that I labeled Brandon Ayuk a potential bust last week. You got Sauce Gardner, you got DJ Reed, you got an incredible defense that is angry and wants to bounce back. And by the way, you have Will Levis on one side of the ball with Calvin Ridley, who can't even drop a rock into the ocean if he was on a shipping boat. Okay? It's really rough right now watching Will Levis play football. I don't think there's a single name you can start in Tennessee. Yes, of course, Calvin Ridley played most of the snaps. You know, we saw DeAndre Hopkins very limited. Maybe he plays more snaps, but there's no way I'm chasing this. As far as the Jets go, though, I absolutely would play Garrett Wilson. 11 targets last week. You know, week 1 with Aaron Rodgers, they're still figuring some stuff out. But this was tied for the 6th highest amount of targets in the NFL in week 1, point blank period. So you got to put them in your lineups. Their on-field chemistry will continue to grow. I personally believe that Allen Lazard is fool's gold. I believe if you're going to start him this week, expecting what happened last week, you will be severely disappointed. We have never seen Allen Lazard ever be consistent in his entire career. All right, the next matchup we're going to look at is the Giants at the Commanders. This should be actually a really fun one for fantasy football, oddly enough. 43.5 point over under. The Commanders are favored. Let's start with the Giants. Malik Neighbors is one of my favorite starts in the NFL this week, point blank, period. I came on this show last week and told you guys, start Chris Godwin. You got to start Godwin. Why? Because the Commanders are the worst secondary in the NFL. In 2023, they gave up the second most points to wide receivers, and then they lost their best cornerback who went to Miami. Okay, this is easily the worst secondary in the NFL. You have to start Malik Neighbors. I'm telling y'all, nobody gave up more points to wide receivers in week 1 than the Commanders. Malik Neighbors played 100% of the snaps in his debut. He never came off the field. They will find ways to get him the ball. I have labeled Wan'Dale Robinson a must sit, but sneakily, I do think you can start him if you're in a deeper format. I'm not going to lie to you. The matchup is so good. And the opposite side of the ball, you can start Terry McLaurin if you like. I'm not going to label him a must start. He's a spot start, my wide receiver 33. 4 targets in week 1 was not ideal. I totally hear you if you're saying that right now. However, there's important context here. The context is Jaden Daniels and the Washington Commanders faced Todd Bowles. We know Todd Bowles' defenses love to blitz. And they were blitzing all day. Daniels was top 5 in pressure rate. He had the quickest time to throw in the NFL. So we could see Jaden Daniels with less pressure versus the Giants throw the ball a little bit more. And Terry McLaurin is a fine start if that's the best option you've got. Okay, the 12th matchup we're looking at here is the Rams at the Cardinals. We have finally made it to the afternoon slate of games. So again, you've probably got some pizza in your belly. You know, the carbs are really setting in. You're trying to keep your eyes open. Well, we're starting off with an absolute banger here. Rams at the Cardinals. Great game. Second highest over-under of the week. Vegas expects about 50 points. And this is tied for the closest spread of the week, which means it should be a very, very tight affair. Let's start with the Rams. You start Cooper Kupp. You had 21 targets. I don't need to tell you anymore. You start Cooper Kupp, okay? How about Demarcus Robinson, though? I think if you're going to start one of the names between Demarcus Robinson, Tyler Johnson, Jordan Whittington, for me, that is Demarcus Robinson. We have already seen him be a successful fantasy wide receiver in previous seasons when one of Cooper Kupp or one of Puka Nacua was not able to play. And in week 1, he had 72 out of 78 snaps. He ran 47 out of 51 routes available to him, and he had 7 targets. And now he faces the Cardinals, who were top 10 in points allowed to wide receivers last week. You can absolutely play Demarcus Robinson. As crazy as it sounds, I'd play Demarcus Robinson over Calvin Ridley this week. That's how much I hate Calvin Ridley in week number 2. Now, as far as the Cardinals go, the Rams were 14th in points allowed to wide receivers last week. We are starting Marvin Harrison Jr. I know, guys, it's been rough. Kyler Murray came out in an interview and said, it's not my job to target him. It's the offensive coordinator's job to scheme it up. That's not what you want to hear. But I'm personally not giving up on Marvin Harrison. There's a lot of reasons why week 1 did not work out. Number 1, it's the dude's first game in the NFL. Number 2, the wind was a genuine problem. We had multiple reports from people who went to the game who said, hey, the deep ball was not an option. The wind was just too crazy in Buffalo. Also, we saw that the Bills were double teaming Marvin Harrison all day long. And the last reason to have hope is he played 55 out of 61 snaps. He ran 36 out of 38 possible routes. And the targets are going to be on the way. I promise you, they will come at some point. We can't start Michael Wilson. You can consider Greg Dortch if you want. You know, he's coming off a game where he had 8 targets. You know, he had 26 routes run. So this is maybe like a safety blanket for Kyler Murray. But I would only consider Dortch if you're in a very, very deep format. Okay, the 13th matchup we're going to look at is the Steelers at the Broncos. This is by far the most boring game of the week. I cannot believe they put this in the second slate of games. There's very few games to watch, and you're going to force me to watch Steelers at Broncos? The lowest over-under of the week, and you're shoving that in my face when I've got nothing else to watch? This might be a rough one, guys. This might be a rough one. George Pickens was a must-start for me last week. I am now labeling him a spot start. Pat Surtain is a real deal. We just saw Pat Surtain lock down DK Metcalf. I was willing to play George Pickens last week versus AJ Terrell and the Falcons. I'm a little bit more concerned here in week 2, but he is still a spot start. And for the Broncos, sure, you can throw Courtland Sutton out there, but I would say 80% of people have a much better option than Courtland Sutton in their lineup. The good news, 12 targets for Courtland Sutton. The bad news, that only turned into 4 receptions, and Bo Nix did not look very good in week numero uno. So personally, I think most of you have a better option than Courtland Sutton. Okay, the 14th game that we're going to look at here, and this is maybe the most anticipated game of the week. Bengals at Chiefs. Joe Burrow comes back to Arrowhead. 48.5 point over under. The Chiefs are favored at home, and this is tied for the 3rd highest over under of the week. Let's start with the Bengals side of the ball here. The Chiefs are a very difficult matchup. We saw that last week, even without L'Jarius Sneed. Okay, they gave up a lot of points to Isaiah Likely, but wide receivers wise, no one really got anything. I still think you have to start Jamar Chase. Incredibly weird week 1 for this entire team. Joe Burrow is still figuring out the wrist. T. Higgins gets injured randomly, of course. Again, it's like a scheduled tweet. Then you have Jamar Chase, who's kind of holding out, kind of playing. The vibes were just completely wrong with this team. But it's not uncommon. I mean, go look at the last couple of years. We have seen the Bengals start weird. We've seen them start really bad. They always pick it up second half of the season or the next couple weeks into the season. Jamar Chase, there is years of evidence that both Chase and Higgins are incredible starts. Do not overthink week 1. If Jamar Chase is there and he's ready to go, you start him. If T. Higgins is there and he's ready to go, you start him. Monitor T. Higgins' practice reports for the rest of the week. If he's going to play, you can absolutely put him out there. But of course, a hamstring, there's a chance that he doesn't play. If he doesn't, we are not starting Andre Yeshivas. We found that out last week. It is not a legitimate option. As far as the Chiefs go, last week, the Bengals technically gave up the second fewest points to fantasy wide receivers. So you might look at this and think, oh, this is a tough matchup. Should we chase this? That's the wrong way to look at this. Remember, last week, the Bengals faced the Patriots. The Patriots were up the entire game. The Patriots never needed to throw the ball. The Patriots do not have elite playmakers like the Chiefs. This is still a very good matchup for your Chiefs wide receivers. Rashee Rice, a must start. Another my guy in 2024. My guy, Timothy, Mr. Tokyo Drift himself. Okay, you start Rashee Rice. Xavier Worthy, incredible performance in week 1. We have to remember he only touched the ball 4 times, so I will label him a spot start. Look, like Brian Thomas, I got to ask the question, do you like to party? Because if you like to party, you can put Xavier Worthy in the game, but not every party you go to is beneficial for your life, okay? Some of those parties mess you up big time. We know that. Now, as far as Marquise Hollywood Brown, if Hollywood Brown does play, I am way less comfortable playing Xavier Worthy. We'll still be playing Rashee Rice, of course. But if Hollywood Brown does not play, that gives you a little more confidence to put Worthy out there. And if Hollywood plays himself, I don't want to personally play him, but I can see in deeper formats how he might be the best option. All right, Sunday Night Football. We've got Bears at Texans. This will be a really fun one. Caleb Williams, CJ Stroud. Can the Bears offense finally gel? The over-under is 46.5 points. The Texans are favored. Let's start with the Bears side of the ball. The Texans gave up the 5th most points to fantasy wide receivers in week 1. So there is a little window here for the Bears to figure something out. DJ Moore is a must start for me. 8 targets in week 1. The offense looked completely out of sync. Let's hope that changes. And I am going to label Keenan Allen a must start as well, my wide receiver 27. I mean, he led the team in targets with 11. He dropped an easy touchdown. That is not the Keenan Allen we know, but the issue is he's not practicing at the time of recording. So again, something to monitor. If he plays, I definitely want to start him. As far as Rome Odunze goes, I really don't think he's going to be out there. He is week to week with a knee injury. So even if he does play, I don't personally want to start him unless Keenan Allen is out. But regardless, all of this sounds really good for DJ Moore. DJ Moore might have 10, 11, 12 targets in this one. As far as the Texans go, you can start every single one of these names. It was working out for Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs last week. And for Tank Dell, it wasn't that great. But you have to be okay with one of these names not panning out on any given week, even Nico Collins. They're all getting great looks, though, which is great to see, and they're all in this high-powered offense. If you look at routes run, Nico Collins was at 33. Stephon Diggs was at 35, and Tank Dell was at 34. You saw Tank Dell with 8 targets, Nico Collins with 8 targets. So yes, while Tank Dell is not playing the same amount of snaps as the other 2 guys, he is still a reliable option in fantasy football. Guys, if you could tell me Tank Dell got 8 targets from CJ Stroud every game, I would tell you he's going to be a top 15 wide receiver at the end of the season. That's how good this offense can be. All right, and the last matchup we are going to look at is Falcons at Eagles. This is Monday Night Football. The Eagles are favored. Of course, they should be. The Falcons came out like a wet noodle in week 1 with Kirk Cousins, all right? But let's talk about those Falcons. I still would label Drake London a must start. It was a very rough start. We know that. But this team has been super vocal this entire week about getting Drake London the ball. And this is a good matchup to chase. Last week, I told you guys to start your Packers because the Eagles secondary was suspect. For some reason, Eagles fans could not hear that with any sort of lack of bias. They said, we drafted a cornerback in round 1. We drafted a cornerback in round 2. Of course, our secondary is going to be better. And then you see they gave up the 3rd most points to fantasy wide receivers in week 1. It's almost as if drafting a rookie cornerback does not always mean you're instantly a better secondary. Sure, they could be better over the course of the season, but they are still figuring things out. They are still very suspect. You can still play your wide receivers against these guys. We've seen that already. Now, as far as the Eagles go, of course you are starting A.J. Brown. Of course you are starting Devonta Smith. We don't need to talk about that. These are guys that are locked and loaded in your week, in your lineup every single week. We know Devonta Smith has that 30-point ceiling on any given game. So that matchup is pretty easy to talk about. That's it for today, guys. I appreciate you for watching. Do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe if you like the content. And the last thing I'll say is if you have a start sit question and you desperately need us to answer it, or a trade question or whatever it might be, check out the pinned comment down below, guys. We've got a website where you can submit any question and you'll get a response from myself throughout the entire week, no matter if we are live or not on the channel. I appreciate you for watching. We'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.